righty. So we got done talking about how labor unions started, and we looked briefly at the sort of three early national labor unions: the National Labor Union itself, the Knights of Labor, and the AFL. What we're going to look at now is sort of like the bad part. Beginning in the 1870s, now there had been blips on the radar before. We talked about this as far as like the New York City draft riots during the Civil War that were actually really kind of the result of Marxist influence on the labor unions, convincing immigrants and poor working people that the bougie rich kids were buying their way out of military service and basically, forcing the immigrants and the poor to go and fight for them by paying them off. And there were other, incidents and uprisings, but nothing like what we're going to talk about now. The first real big violent thing is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. So, a little bit of background. The Transcontinental Railroad was approved in the, I think it's in 1863, actually during the Civil War. And the government began allocating huge amounts of money to pay for the Transcontinental Railroad. And the companies that engaged in building not just the main Transcontinental Railroad between the Central and Union Pacifics, but the other ones that moved around, were the beneficiaries of political entrepreneurship, which, if you remember, political entrepreneurship is when the government is your customer. The government was paying, I want to say, I think it was 10,000 miles or $10,000 per square mile or per mile of track laid. In addition, the railroad company received a mile of land on both sides of the track. They could do what they wanted with that land. There are 360 acres in a mile, which meant that you could cut that piece up in 1 acre plots, half-acre plots, whatever you wanted to do, and sell it off by the acre. So these railroad companies were making massive amounts of money, right? And something I need to explain here. These railroad companies did not just like go in a straight line. So here's Utah. It's not like they go from California to Utah and then they meet up the other one, which was running because Chicago was the railroad hub of the United States. Like all major rail lines went through Chicago. And it's not like then, you go from Chicago to Utah. So altogether from Chicago to Utah, I want to say is somewhere in the neighborhood of like 1,500 miles. I'd have to look up the exact mileage, but let's just say 1,500. At $10,000 a mile, you're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of like $15 million to go from Chicago to Utah. And similarly, from California to Utah at 500 miles, let's say, you're looking at like $4.5 million that way. Or what is it? It'd be 7.5 million, something like that. 5 million. I don't know. Too many numbers. I was totally doing no math. That's a lot of money, including the land. But here's the thing. Political entrepreneurship, which is crony capitalism, isn't happy with just making money. They want to make lots of money. So why bother to go in a straight line when instead you can go woo, woo, like all over the place? So what should be like a 1,500-mile journey turns into like a 5,000 or 6,000 mile journey. And they were getting paid for every one of those miles by the government because the government just spent money stupid. Now, here's the thing. As these railroads are doing this, okay, They are making big money. People see this. People begin buying stock in railroads, which makes the railroads more valuable. People decide they're going to start their own railroads, and they go to the banks and say, will you give us a loan to start a railroad? And the banks look and see how well the railroad business is doing, and they say, sure, here's a loan for your new railroad. Not only are they loaning money out for people to build railroads, they're also buying stock in these railroads, causing the value of them to go up even further. The more of them that develop, the more government contracts get handed out, the more political entrepreneur waste that results. This goes on for about let's say roughly about 10 years. What ends up happening is this. By 1875, we have a big problem. Problem number one, useless Grant had flooded the market with gold, causing a massive drop in the economy. So you have that problem going on already. As the economy begins to slowly recover from Grant's stupidity, we now have a situation by 1875, just a year before the Philadelphia World Expo. In 1875, there are more railroads available than there are customers to use those railroads. Now, there's a couple of things to keep in mind with this. Number one, some of this has to do with this. The railroads, in an effort to build further, when the Transcontinental Road had been completed, the new railroad companies begin building into areas where nobody lives. I mean, they're building rail lines through the middle of like rural North Dakota into Montana. There's like nothing but mountain goats and bighorn sheep out there and bears. The logic that the railroads were employing was as we build this out, people will follow the railroad and just build up cities and towns along the rail lines. In theory, it's good, but the problem is that theory doesn't take into account the unintended consequence of this overbuilding, which is there's more supply than there is demand. I don't have to go to Railroad A to ship my goods or to travel because I could go to Railroad C, D, E, G, M, or Q. They all run the same basic direction. And they're all willing to cut me a deal to go on their railroad, which means more supply, less demand means prices drop, which means by 1875, the country had entered another political problem, another economic recession because of the overexpansion of the railroads. The railroads were losing money because they had built too much. Not only were the railroads losing money, the banks were losing money because they had invested in these railroads. And now those investments were not paying well. And people were now going bankrupt because they couldn't afford to pay off the loans that the bank was demanding be cashed in and paid off because of the bad investment choices in the railroads. And let's remember, the bank is not investing its money. The bank is investing the money of its customers. That's where banks get their money. So the banks were wasting the money of the customers. What this means is that by 1875, the country is in a big old economic pile of doodle. We got through 1876, World Expo. Things start looking up for American business and manufacturing. Great, it's going to benefit the railroads too, except for the fact that there's still too many of them. And as a result, the prices are still too low. To deal with this, In June of 1877, the Baltimore and Ohio, that's what the B&O is, one of the monopoly railroads, yes, eventually owned by J.P. Morgan. The Baltimore and Ohio announce that they will cut the wages of their employees in half. This does not sit well with the employees. Now, there's a couple of big ironies about what happens. Irony number one, there's no union involved. The B&O has no union. The workers literally decide on their own that they are simply going to go on strike. And they do. On July 14th, the B&O railroad workers walk out. The strike starts in West Virginia. Now, even though there's no union, there's a lot of influence being put on the workers by the socialists and anarchists. And it unfortunately impacts the workers. And other people also start getting squirrely. So the union starts in West Virginia. West Virginia, Mountain Mama, take me home. No railroads. West Virginia's rail traffic grounds to a halt. The railroad company complains to the governor. The governor of West Virginia sends out the state militia, the National Guard. Hut, 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 hut. Here they come. Here comes the National Guard. National Guard. You all got to disperse and go home. Wait a second. Lukey, is that you over there? Hi, Jed. Lukey, what you doing out here on strike? Lukey, what you work? Why you ain't working, Lukey? You gonna cut my wages in half, Jed? How am I supposed to support my family? I got youngins and got new youngin coming on the way. National Guard. That ain't right. No, that ain't right at all. No, Lukey, you keep on strike, Lukey. Heck, we're gonna go home. Come on, boys. National Guard, they just leave. National Guard literally just walks away and leaves. That's it. Ain't gonna do nothing. Nope, not gonna help on that one. So, Governor of West Virginia decides to take option number two. He calls the president, who at that time is the just newly inaugurated Rutherford Bertrand Hayes. Hayes has only been in office for 4 months when he gets a call or telegram from the governor of West Virginia. You got to do something. Hayes has no choice. He sends the army in. Now, the really sad part about this is, as we'll look at the end of this, Hayes actually agreed with the workers. He felt that the railroads had made their own dumb decisions and they needed to figure out how to pay for it without penalizing the workers. He understood exactly why the workers went out on strike. Heck, in fact, he kind of agreed with them. But he couldn't really work on the idea that they were interfering with interstate commerce. So he had to go help. What ends up happening, the army comes in and the West Virginia strike ends. But that's not the end of it. Oh, no. By this point in time, the anarchists and socialists had succeeded in spreading the strike out. The city of Baltimore, Maryland, is right next to West Virginia. In the city of Baltimore, they're on strike too. Here come the Baltimore, Maryland National Guard. You men need to disperse and go back home. Otherwise, we will be forced to take you prisoner because we have guns. The strikers. Funny thing, we have guns too, and we outnumber you. Oh. The National Guard is literally held hostage for 2 days in the Baltimore Railroad Yard by the strikers, who are better armed than the National Guard is. The Army has to come in and rescue the Maryland State Militia from the strikers. But not to be outdone, there's a city of Pittsburgh, because Pennsylvania is right next to West Virginia, too. In Pittsburgh, the strikers actually light the railroad depot downtown Pittsburgh on fire. Now, what could possibly go wrong here? Well, let's think about this. Railroad cars made of wood. Railroad ties, that's the stuff that goes in the ground that they, built the tracks on. Those are made of wood. And not only are they made of wood, they're soaked with a chemical called creosote that actually is highly flammable. There's oil to grease the gears, wheels, and tracks to make sure that things run smoothly. Oil, that burns. There's coal to power the engines. Coal, that burns. What ended up happening was a 2-mile long fire in downtown Pittsburgh. By the time the Pittsburgh fire was put out, over 1,400 railroad cars were destroyed, buildings wiped out in the rail yards and in downtown Pittsburgh, and an estimated $5 to $10 million in actual property damage of back then money. We are talking about, in today money, hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. Not to be outdone, because if Pittsburgh does something, Philadelphia's got to do it. They light their railroad yard on fire too. That one just gets contained quicker. All told, from July the 14th to September, I think, the 4th. So a period of about like a month and a half, like literally about 7 weeks. Hayes has to send the army into 7 different states to put down strikes. This reinforces the idea in people's minds that the unions, even though they didn't start the strikes, that the unions are members of a vast conspiracy to overthrow the government and destabilize everything. The result of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877? Millions of dollars in damage. In today money, it would be into the billions. Millions of dollars in lost railroad business money. And an estimated $600,000 in lost wages for the employees. Money that they never got back. So great irony of the strike, number one, is that it wasn't even started by the unions. Great irony, number two. After the strike was over, the B&O sat down with its employees. The employees accused the B&O of basically being super rich and hoarding money and not sharing, and the B&O opened up their books and showed the employees just how bad things were. And the employees were shocked to find out that the B&O was actually losing money. But here's the thing. The railroad discovered just how much it depended on those workers as well. And after talking with each other, they came to a conclusion. The B&O still slashed wages, but they set up an insurance system for any damages or harm caused on the job to their workers. And they set up retirement accounts for their employees. You probably could have avoided all the violence had you just started by talking. Go figure. Okay, that's it for this one. Tomorrow or the next lesson, we are going to talk about the Great Haymarket Riot. And boy, is that a something. Okay, peace out. Peace and love.